Everybody, we are back after a lengthy holiday hiatus, and Consume the Canon is moving along full speed. We are going to look at the first couple of items that are in the canon, and I have already gotten through. And then in a follow-up part, we're going to talk about the next section, which is really going to focus on the first season of Clone Wars. Further editions of Consume the Canon, we'll talk about additional seasons of Clone Wars, other films, and we'll also be talking about some of the things that we've skipped, which in this early part of the canon, there's actually a lot of things that are in my spreadsheet that we're not covering because, frankly, they haven't come out yet. So, without further ado, let's get started and talk about all of the stuff that we're going over and Consume the Canon. All right, so first item in the canon is the short story, A Recipe for Death. Now, if you're following along on my Instagram, you see the really short versions of the reviews that I've done, but my goal here is to do a little bit more in-depth reviews. Now, they're not going to be super detailed. We leave that for other podcasters and other YouTube channels. We've got way too much stuff to cover, so we're not going to go in depth. However, I do want to say that as the first thing in the canon, this thing is super, super cool. Written by Landry Q. Walker, A Recipe for Death is a short story about the kitchen in Maz Kanata's castle, and specifically the folks who work within that kitchen. It's this really interesting mix of noir and the Iron Chef. There's actually like an Iron Chef battle to determine who's going to be the new sous chef in the kitchen of Maz Kanata's castle, but it's all a ruse to try and figure out who murdered the previous sous chef. It's really neat. It's really interesting. It's pretty short, but it's definitely a lot of fun to read. And it's from the Tales from a Galaxy Far, Far Away, Volume 1 Aliens collection. So if you have a chance, go check it out. Now, A Recipe for Death doesn't actually have any of your typical canon characters in it. You know, Yoda and Obi-Wan and Anakin. None of them appear. You actually don't know the names of anybody who's in it. But the next piece in the canon, which is Yoda's Secret War, is full of canon characters. Specifically, the beginning of issue 1 actually takes place right after the crew of Han Solo and Luke Skywalker and Leia capture a Star Destroyer in issue 24 of the Star Wars run. But then Luke finds an old journal that Obi-Wan kept, and in that journal, Obi-Wan tells of a story that Yoda went through, which happens right before Phantom Menace. Now, the story itself isn't super interesting. I mean, it's fine. It's really one of those explorations of the Force and its power and so forth. The most interesting part of it is, I believe it's issue 4, Yoda fights a mountain. And that's not an exaggeration. A mountain comes to life, and Yoda fights it, and he wins. So it's a really cool display of the power that Yoda has and his connection with the Force. The story's good. It's not really that stellar. The art's pretty cool, but otherwise, it's a fine example of some Star Wars storytelling. Now, one of the things that the Phantom Menace era of content really has a lot of is that's youth reading. So youth reading are books that are specifically targeted towards young Star Wars fans. So things like golden books and really simple breakdowns of the different stories going on in the Star Wars universe. For Yoda's Secret War, there is actually a youth reader short story called Size Matters Not, which is essentially just a retelling of the first issue of the Yoda Secret War 5-part series. Now, there's a few of these that I've gone through already, and what I like about each one of them is they actually give a little bit more detail about what's going on in the background and in the narrative in those comic issues, whereas the comics are all almost explicitly dialogue. These give more of the background about the thoughts, processes of the characters involved. So it's simplified reading, but there are pictures and visuals that go along with it, and the story makes the whole interaction much more engaging. After Yoda's Secret War is another 5-part series called Darth Maul. Darth Maul is the limited 5-issue comic series that talks about Darth Maul and his kind of like initial relationships with the Emperor. Now, he's already been discovered. He is already the Emperor's apprentice. But it's really about his initial challenges of trying to gain the Emperor's favor. At this point, Darth Maul is pretty one-dimensional. Like, his whole thing is just about rage and hatred and anger, and he wants to kill Jedi. That's all he's really looking for. And in the series, he does get the opportunity to hunt down and kill sort of a Jedi, kind of. But he realizes that his hate is bottomless, and you know, it just makes him want to kill Jedi more. Cool thing about this series is it's the first canon timeline introduction of Cad Bane and Aurra Sing, which is neat. And much like Yoda's Secret War, there is a youth reader short story, Darth Maul and the Rathtars, which retells the story in issue 1 of the Darth Maul comic series. And in that, Darth Maul fights some Rathtars. And again, there's much more detail about Darth Maul's thinking and what he's doing within that comic. So if you're really looking for the depth of what's happening in these characters' minds and you know what their processes are for making their decisions, this is a good example of why you want to consume as much of the canon as possible. Before we get to the first film, The Phantom Menace, there are 2 issues of a new series called Age of Republic that came out this December. The first one was Qui-Gon Jinn, and the second was Darth Maul. Qui-Gon Jinn's is really kind of an exploration of the differences between the dark side and the light side of the Force and how they can intertwine. It's fine. I wasn't really that engaged with it. I thought it didn't really add a ton to Qui-Gon's background and biography. It really just explored a little bit more things we already knew about him. So if you have to make some choices about what you are and aren't going to read, I'd say skip this one. Darth Maul, on the other hand, is pretty solid. It shows him getting closer and closer to the Darth Maul that he will be in The Phantom Menace. Shows his rage growing and all of that. And I would definitely recommend it. Darth Maul, of the few that have been released so far, Darth Maul has been my favorite issue. And now we get into The Phantom Menace. So there is a lot of content around The Phantom Menace. Lots of youth content. There's the film. There's a lot of things that were kind of republished to make sure that they were all part of the canon. Let's start with the film. If you haven't watched The Phantom Menace in a long time, it is just as you remember it. It's not great. It has lots of issues with writing and pacing, characterizations. I'm not just talking about Jar Jar. Everything in it feels very shallow, pretty one-dimensional. And there's a lot of stuff in it, too, that feels really anachronistic. You know, like some of the language that's used doesn't feel like it's Star Wars language, especially like the pod race. All of it feels really out of place. If you want to just kind of refresh yourself, though, on the Phantom Menace story, the youth reader content's actually really good. The Golden Book and there's a read-along story series all tell the story really well. It's pretty interesting, though, that each one of them tells the story in a slightly different way, and each one of them leaves out or rephrases things to avoid elements which some people might find a little bit difficult for young kids to deal with. Which is why, if you have to make a choice for Phantom Menace, and really so far any of the Star Wars content for young kids, I would recommend going with the Golden Books. The Golden Books tell really simplified stories, but they don't skip over any of the details that might be kind of difficult. Like, they don't skip over the fact that Anakin's a slave, whereas the read-along storybook does. It says that Anakin, chose to go along with Qui-Gon, which kind of is true, but not really. After the youth reader content, there are a few different collections of prequel stories. There is a graphic novel which tells all of the stories for all 3 of the prequel movies. There's also the 5-minute Star Wars Stories and 5-minute Star Wars Stories Strikes Back, as well as a youth reader collection of prequel stories. Now, each one of these, like I said, tells stories from the entire prequel series. So some of this content I was reading way ahead of time. Further, some of them, like the 5-minute Star Wars stories, actually tell things all the way to Last Jedi. But because the content in the canon timeline wasn't broken out specifically story by story, I read the whole book in each instance. So it's really just an artifact of the canon timeline. Some things are going to sneak ahead in the list like that. There's really no way to get around it. As far as this content is concerned, the graphic novel is really good. Great artwork throughout. The writing itself is basically just captures of the script from the movie. There's very little unique dialogue that's actually written in there, but it's funny how indicative it is of the poor directing choices that the comic actually makes the dialogue seem lively, even though no one is actually alive who's delivering the dialogue. The 5-minute story collections, 5-minute Star Wars Stories and 5-minute Star Wars Stories Strikes Back, are really great. They are really just 5-minute stories, and they're really good introductions to Star Wars and the key moments in the Star Wars universe. If you have a little one, 5, 6, 7, who's interested in Star Wars but can't really sit through a whole movie, maybe, I actually read them to my little one when she's about to go to bed, and they're a really great way to kind of wind down. We still have a few more titles, however, before we get to Attack of the Clones. One of them's a really fun little bonus comic that was in Darth Maul #1 called Probe Droid Problems. It actually doesn't have any dialogue in it or any dialogue between human characters. It's two droids beeping and buzzing at each other who become best friends. One of the droids, though, is one of Darth Maul's scout droids. It's cute, it's fun, it's weird. We also have the first episode of Forces of Destiny, the online series of 3-minute animated shorts that go along with Star Wars. This one is Monster Misunderstanding, and it's told on Naboo while Padme is just transitioning from being the queen to being a senator. The last thing we'll cover in this episode is the Obi-Wan and Anakin 5-issue comic series, as well as A Jedi's Control, which is another short story that tells a youth reader version of the first issue of the 5-issue series. Obi-Wan and Anakin is fantastic. It's really, really great storytelling, great artwork. It shows the really early beginnings of Anakin having trouble with his control, having trouble with the Jedi Order, and it also shows Obi-Wan in a much more rigid place than he is later in the stories. Shows him learning how to be a Jedi Master, learning how to be a teacher, just as much as Anakin is learning how to control his powers. It's a great series, and the youth reader story, A Jedi's Control, is another more in-depth telling of the first issue of that series. It tells a lot more about what Anakin's thinking, what Anakin's feeling, and if you're looking for that background content, it is an absolutely necessary thing for you to read. That's it for this episode. Next time, we're going to start talking about Attack of the Clones and really get into Clone Wars itself. We're going to be really diving into some of these episodes, and we're going to be talking about Clone Wars for a while. Also coming up in near episodes, we've got a review of Catalyst and some of the other comics that are going to start leaking their way into the canon. As for now, this is Josh, and thank you for watching Consume the Canon.